One of the most interesting topics in biomedical research is the problem of aging and death. We have addressed that problem in previous lectures, maybe indirectly, when we explore the problem of how do you make a mathematical model of a system formed by many parts when these parts can fail. And by exploring this problem using reliability theory, we actually were able to see why biology chooses to be parallel instead of series. We can use that theory to actually explore the nature of aging. Aging is a big issue nowadays because we start to suspect that aging is a process that has been, if you want, implemented by evolutionary dynamics, but that doesn't mean that aging cannot be, to some extent, reverted. And the first step in understanding that implies to understand the nature of the dynamics of aging. This is something that is well known in engineering. Machines and devices also age. And it's a classical concept from engineering design known as the Bathtube Curve, which essentially accounts for the observation that when you look at the likelihood of a given device or machine to actually work or fail, there's kind of a characteristic shape in the way we, for example, can measure the probability that a given device will fail. Once it appears it's been designed, built, and delivered, and what happens typically is that there's a phase, right, when untested devices can fail, right? So intrinsic failures can happen, making the system unable to work. Then there's a phase, the phase that we used to enjoy if things have been well designed, right, more or less long, where the system works properly. And eventually, this becomes something that is less and less likely to work. Failure rapidly increases over time, okay? Why is that? Why that shape, right? Let me say that this is a bit exaggerated picture, but you see the name of the bath tube is quite clear why here. So how is this connected with living systems, and particularly with aging in humans? Well, it's pretty much connected, and actually there's two ways of looking at that. If I look at failure in terms of the failure of a living being, of dying, right, the probability of death, if you look at data from human populations, this would be time in years, you'll see essentially in a linear scale, kind of a more or less flat domain here, followed by the rapid increase, right? As you know also, we have a tool to actually see details that escape our attention here, like this part here, using logarithmic scales. In that way, we actually kind of amplify the smaller scales and see what happens in humans. It's something like this. It's quite interesting for many reasons. We could distinguish essentially three interesting domains here. One is related with infant mortality, right? Children die, right, in this phase as a consequence of what? A consequence of that something typically related with genetic defects delivers some kind of disease state that ends up in death, right? This domain here, right, is a bit exaggerated. In the 21st century, things have changed a lot, and with actually infant mortality, and so the slope here is much smaller. Then there's this phase of rapid increase in mortality, right? We also have this kind of bathtube effect here, the young people, and an interesting shape here, which essentially beyond 100 years of age, death is slower. And what happens is that you have this kind of saturation effect. How do we explain this kind of phenomenon, right? And what's the meaning of that? There's an alternative way of looking at that, and it's called survival curves, right? Here, what you do is very often times in the clinical papers, what you see, for example, is you have a sample of people, let's say 100 people, and you look at how many of them are there, right, after a number of years, okay? That will be also a probability. That's what we like to use, right? So that would be kind of probability for the whole group. It's a normalization, okay? And what we observe is, in this linear log system, is that it's quite a flat domain with a little curvature here that goes down slowly, right? So you enjoy kind of a good chances to survive. And then, right, and it's connected with what we've just been mentioning here. You have this decline, right, after a given threshold value. And you can also use these survival curves to actually compare the demography of different ages, right, and see that thanks to the many advances that we achieve in medicine, for example, infant death, which was huge just 100 years ago, right, has been strongly reduced in time, right? As it has been reduced, the likelihood that you die in a young age, right? Interestingly, right, and we will address that in some other lecture, what might happen is that it's not so, I mean, this very old people has been around from a long time ago. People with 100 years of age has been there. It's been less and less likely to observe them, but we haven't observed people with 150 years or 30 years. That actually points in the direction that maybe there are strong constraints into how far can you go into the lifespan. That's another issue. What I want to show you here is that a very simple mathematical model that connects with the probabilistic models we analyze using reliability theory can actually explain a lot of what we see here, right? We'll make approximations. So we are not going to, in this freshman course, we are not going to use heavy maths. So I'll actually point what are the limitations and what you can do as an exercise to keep going. All right, to actually start understanding this, let's take phase one. Right? We'll separate the different domains here. And for phase one, what I want to calculate is that's the probability of death, right? Imagining that my system is actually an individual, right? An individual that I can consider made of a number of parts, a set of parts. Remember reliability theory, my system now is my individual, and these are kind of all subsystems that are necessary for survival, right? Think about essential physiological traits that have to be maintained when you are a kid, right, or an infant. All right, in the lectures on reliability, these will be one of our systems, right? And suppose that we have n of them. There are n essential parts, right, that need to work. All of them are necessary, okay? Now, there's an extra dimension here. I have to introduce time, right? In our analysis of reliability, we didn't talk about time, okay? Now we need to put a time scale. And I want to show that this domain here is describable with an exponential function, which actually you can see that when I plot the linear log plot, this is more or less linear, right? Because it's an exponential decay. Let's show that this is the case. To do it, let's consider the following. We start with a time scale. This is time of birth, all right? And imagine that I want to calculate the probability of surviving exactly until time t, right? A given time, this one here. Okay, so how can we calculate the probability of survival in this toy model? Let's forget for a moment about the internal structure, right? Somehow, what I have is an intrinsic rate of death at each moment, right? And what I want to guarantee is that once I reach time t, okay, life ends. So I calculate properly the probability of surviving until that time step. So my probability of survival for my system at time t, okay, can be calculated in the following way. Imagine that I made a partition of my system, of my time scale, right, in arbitrary intervals. So this is a size delta t, a given time interval. And this is a partition that implies that I have different subsets of time, gamma 1, gamma 2, oops, etc. Okay. Strictly speaking, that means that I have different intervals defined as k minus 1 delta t, k delta t. Just simply saying that start somewhere here and somewhere here. All right? Now, what assumptions can I make? Well, within each arbitrary interval, because this is a time scale that is arbitrary, I'm assuming that there's some instant death rate, right? There's some death rate, mu k, okay, that I assume constant over this specific interval. As you can see, this is what you used to do when we do calculus, right? We do first approximation and then we try to go into the limit. So what I want to do is to actually guarantee that I get from here to here, right? So what's the probability of death within a given interval, right? Well, if I consider this particular interval, this is instant death rate. It depends on the value of delta t, right? We know that, okay? The larger delta t, the more likelihood that you die, all right? Okay, so for each interval, this is actually the probability of death, right? And it's a first approximation, so assuming that mu is small. So in order to die exactly after t time steps, right, using this kind of formalism, what I want to do is the following. I want to ensure that I don't die in the first interval, right? Okay? And I don't die in the second interval, right? That would be for gamma 2, and so on and so forth, right? I'm going to survive until the last segment here, right? But then, once this is finished, I die, right? So that's the exact way of putting it here. And one thing I can do, for example, is actually put this as a number, right? The instant death rate, because we just finished, and this will be actually the general form, right? This will describe, in general, assuming that within each interval I have a constant rate, characteristic constant rate, and that this linear approximation is a valid one, right? This will be the expression for the domain here, right? This part of the behavior for survival, right? That will be a probability. Let's make it nicer. This is actually a constant, right? We shouldn't bother much about that, and we want to look at is not exactly fitting data, but understanding the nature of this decay, right? That is exponential. Very good. So that, if we assume that all these k's, mu k's are equal, again, this is the first approximation, and we ignore a lot of the details of the biology, this actually reads probability of survival, good read, under this approximation, it's mu, this quantity here. This product actually doesn't need to be labeled, right? We only have n times the same term. and that means that this is mu. That's what we have. Okay, we are almost there. Very good. So this is a good approximation with this discrete picture, but of course delta t is arbitrary, right? Let's actually convert that into something that is mathematically consistent. What is delta t? Delta t actually is the total length of my interval, right, divided by n. I made n partition, right? So in fact, delta t is nothing but this, okay? So if I put this into this expression, right, probability of survival will take the form 1 minus mu t over n, okay? I use that because it's up to constant factors that I don't care about, right? And now we can actually do the last step. Since I don't want to use an arbitrary partition, I want to make the partition as mathematically continuous as possible. What I do actually is to do the limit, right? Consider I make a very fine partition. And as you know, when I do that, this is actually one of these indeterminate limits of this form, right? And makes this go to 0, so this is kind of going to 1, this is going to infinity, very large n. And this, you can actually show very easily, leads into the final result. This is an exponential function. Let's put it here like this way. So this is my first result, a mathematical proof that under the conditions I'm exploring here, okay, assuming that you have a constant death rate over time of failure of my system, right? And again, the underlying biology is that there are essential parts that have to work, okay, and that can fail every time since I started to be alive or born, okay. My expression here in this approximation goes into an exponential decay. So we have explained the first part of the bathtube curve or the survival curve for humans. Now we have a bigger challenge. We have gone into this phase, and now we have a full-blown human, right? Has been growing with all the organs and everything in place. And now we need to explain why we have this particular rapid growth, explain the shape of this, and this paradoxical phenomenon. Why, when we are entering into this aging phase beyond a given threshold, things appear to stabilize. All right, so we have seen that in the first step of this process, in the first phase, we have exponential decay. Now let's decouple that from the next part, right? So we need to make other assumptions. We have an individual now made of a number of organs working in parallel and series. Each of these organs is made of a large number of subunits, right? There's a huge degree of redundancy. You'll see why this is relevant. And now the question is, how do I formulate a theory for that part here? And whether or not this theory can account for this peculiar behavior here. All right, how can I do that? The full story here is it's relatively complex. It's going to be an exercise for you. What I'm going to do is to consider one case study that it's more connected with this kind of scenario, right? Let us assume that I have a system, let me make a big abstraction here, that is made of different parts, all right? Different subsystems working in parallel, right? We have seen that in our analysis of parallel systems in reliability theory. So my system now, which will be my individual, will be formed by different parts, right? S1, S2, Sn, right? Could belong to this collection of organs, right? Organ 1, organ 2, organ n, okay? Well, let's make the abstraction I was just mentioning, okay? Here, consider the following. Imagine that, as in parallel systems, what I want to guarantee is that the system is functional, right? Now, in time, in our previous calculations, we didn't have time, and that means that I want to calculate the probability, right, of my system of failing to function, right? Fails to function. I'm using the language now of engineering. I have a device that fails, right? In the context of aging, that means probability of death, right? Well, at a given time step, this is going to happen, right? Under what conditions? Well, since I have a parallel system, right? Remember that failure only happens if every single element here fails, all right? If I rethink that, and we'll go back to that later on, in a way is that if I look at a given organ, forget about the rest, right? This organ could be my system, and it's made of many redundant parts, right? In order for an organ to fail, in a very abstract way, I need to have a massive failure of the system, okay? So, the only potential case where the parallel system can fail is that every single unit fails. We know that. Meaning that is the probability that system 1 fails at time t, probability that system 2 fails at time t, etc., etc. And again, I'm supposing that they have n parallel parts, okay? Okay, so that implies what? Okay, I can calculate that. Well, if you want, I can use the compact form. All right? And now I can actually use the expression that defines the probability of the system of working, right? If pk is the probability of my system of working, all right? 1 minus pk it's what actually introduces failure, and this should be time dependent, right? Okay. Okay, very good. So one of the things that we can use from the past part of the analysis is the fact that we already know something about this, right? This is something that decays in time, right? In such a way that I can actually use this formalism, right? If I take again the same notation, right? But in this case, just limiting myself for every part in the system, right? For every subpart, I will have an exponential decay that I can use explicitly here, right? And that will be kind of the general form of what I'm looking for, okay? Again, this is a bit cumbersome, and mu k will include details specific for each subpart, okay? Let's assume, as usual, that we consider a homogeneous case, right? More or less everything behaves the same way, okay? In that way, this just gives this, all right? Okay, good. So this is actually the solution I was looking for. What's the shape of that, right? That's the probability of failure to function, or the probability of dying, right? Probability of death, okay? That should actually account for at least the qualitative behavior of this function here. You can easily check, right? This, of course, when t is 0, right? And, okay, this function here, and rapidly grows at some point, and more interestingly, it saturates. Meaning what? Meaning that, and you can actually check that, right? There's a rapid growth here that has exponential character, right? There's a really fast growth in failure rate. And this saturation here, which might appear as a kind of a interesting puzzle, why very old people take actually longer to die, right? Actually becomes part of a mathematical property of parallel systems, right? It's something that's inevitable, it's going to happen, right? So in this description, part 3, part 2, with all the limitations of the formalism we have introduced, belong to the same kind of phenomenon, right? So we have account for essentially the mathematical reasons why we have the bathtube curve. Is that what actually fits well and applies to our description of a living being, a human? Well, not quite, right? And that's an exercise for you. The right picture should include the following, right? And I'll give you this and another interesting exercise. Actually, each element here, each system is made of many systems. And over time, I need all of them working. Every organ has to work. If a single organ fails, all the system fails. And every single organ is made of a parallel range of systems, right? You can think in cells, you can think in subsystems within cells or tissues, okay? But the right picture under this approximation is the following. And I want you to think about what would be the mathematical result for this, right? My system is made of multiple elements, each one involving a parallel description. Again, think if you want in a simplified way in cells, right? Many redundant parts. And all of these systems have to work, right? So I put them in series because remember, if this could be an organ, right? This is subsystems within an organ. All of them have to work. Failure of one organ implies death, right? With exceptions. And within each, you have all the redundant parts. So it's actually a combination of parallel and series circuits. The exercise is write down the expression that will generalize completely this and see what's the implications, right? Of the degree of redundancy of the parts and the number of elements here. And finally, my second exercise for you, right, is something to think about. It's actually two parts. It has to do with, in natural systems, how this generalizes when I'm not considering humans, for example, right? When I'm considering other kinds of species. For humans, the picture I plotted you before is what I just was showing you before this here, right? So time and the probability of survival, okay? So here we'll have newborns, we'll have adults, and old people, all right? Imagine you take, that's for us and for elephants and for primates. Imagine you take a songbird, for example, right? Songbirds have a very different curve, something very much like this, right? Here, it's important, right? I'm considering something that you have to think about how to do it, how you renormalize time, because of course a songbird just lives a few years, the most, right? So this to normalize our long lifespan with a bird, you have to rescale time, but it's very easy. Essentially, you have this shape, right? So here you will have the egg, here. Here you will have the little chicks, and here you have the adults, right? But look at that. I mean, the question is, what kind of drivers do we have here in such a way that the decay goes like this, right? What makes the biology different? And finally, if you take amphibians, most fish, and plants, you have a totally different survival curve. Huge mortality, that would be some seed, right? For example, the small plants, right, siblings, and a tree, for example, right? Again, you have to rescale things. Trees can live a lot of time. But the curve is very different. So my questions are, how can you explain the nature of these essentially three classes of survival curves? What would be the mathematical background that you can actually use to account for them, right? And let me make you a final exercise, an interesting question to think about. How these curves, both these and these, will change if anti-aging therapies will exist, right? I'm not referring to all the propaganda of take this thing that you'll get younger in some way. That goes in the whole crap with Reiki and homeopathy. No, what I'm saying is that imagine that it was possible to have a CRISPR therapy, something that changes actually the aging nature of humans, how that will impact these curves, right? There are some trivial consequences and some really interesting consequences of that, and I want you to think about all of them.